In the late 1800s, British soldiers marched into a quiet corner southern Nigeria of West Africa. They expected palm oil, taxes, obedience. What they didn't expect was to meet a ghost army. They had the guns, the soldiers, the ships, the power of an empire that stretched across the world. And they thought they had the Igbo people, a proud, independent nation, under their thumb. But they were wrong, because deep in the forests of Anioma land, an invisible army was forming, a resistance so secret, so coordinated, and so determined that for decades, the mighty British couldn't crush it. These warriors didn't wear uniforms, didn't fight in open battle lines, and often couldn't even be seen. The British gave them a name out of fear, the Ekumeku, and what followed was a shadow war unlike anything you've ever heard. A war of ambushes, coded messages, betrayal, and the burning question, how long can you fight an empire without becoming the very thing you're resisting? A resistance so secret, so disciplined, that for more than 30 years they struck from the shadows, then vanished into the forests before the British even knew what hit them. The British called them terrorists. The Anioma people called them Ekumeku, and their story has been buried for over a century. Chapter 1. The Spark. It's 1883. Picture a bustling Igbo town in Anioma, part of the Niger Delta region. The air is alive with traders selling palm oil, yams, and kola nuts. Families are gathered in compounds. Children are chasing one another through the dust. Life is as it has been for centuries. And then the British arrive. At first, it's not war. It's treaties, friendly handshakes, promises. The Royal Niger Company, backed by the Crown, insists they just want trade. But beneath the smiles is something darker, a plan to take complete control. The British don't see equals. They see resources, palm oil for their machines, land for their empire, and people, strong, resourceful Igbo people, as labor. When local chiefs push back, refusing to sign unfair agreements, the British switch tactics. They send soldiers, guns, cannons. Entire villages are burned to the ground as lessons. Anyone who resists is branded a criminal. But here's the problem. The Igbo are not a people easily broken. They don't have kings to bribe or armies to defeat in one stroke. Power is spread across communities, clans, elders. Kill one leader and another rises. Burn one town and 10 more tighten their bonds. By 1884, whispers begin to spread in Anioma towns. We need to resist, not as scattered villages, but as one. And so, in secret, a network begins to form. They call themselves the Ekumeku, a word meaning silent, invisible, or the hidden ones. At first, they're just a rumor. British officers write reports of strange, organized attacks, convoys ambushed, soldiers shot with poisoned arrows from the tree-line, warehouses mysteriously set on fire. The British can't understand how these attacks are happening. Villagers they interrogate shrug and say, "We don't know." But of course they do. Everyone knows. Because the Ekumeku aren't outsiders. They're farmers, hunters, traders, fathers, sons. They live in the very towns the British are trying to control. And that's what makes them terrifying. They can't be seen. They can't be bought. And they are everywhere. By 1885, this quiet resistance explodes into a full-blown underground war. Chapter 2. The Shadow Army. By 1885, the British had a problem. On paper, they controlled Anioma. They had forts, outposts, trade stations, and armed patrols moving through the towns. But in reality, the land wasn't theirs. Not really. Because every time they marched into a village, the resistance melted away into the forests. And every time they left, the Ekumeku reappeared. And here's the terrifying part. Nobody knew who they really were. See, the Ekumeku weren't an army in the traditional sense. They had no barracks, no flags, no marching drums. They were a shadow network that stretched across more than 20 Anioma communities. Each group had its own fighters, but they all answered to one cause: keep the British out. And the way they communicated? Brilliant. They used talking drums, palm fronds tied in patterns, coded proverbs passed through markets. A stranger could walk through Anioma and hear nothing but chatter and gossip. But for those who knew the code, every word was an instruction. Meet at dusk. Strike at dawn. Do not trust the messenger. Information flowed invisibly, like a river under the earth. And the British never saw it coming. The first strikes the Ekumeku fought like ghosts. They didn't march up to British forts and demand battle. No, they hid in the thickets and struck when least expected. Convoys carrying supplies were ambushed. Patrols vanished into the forests, never to return. British traders woke to find their warehouses in flames. The British would raid a town, searching for fighters. They'd grab a dozen young men, lock them up, sometimes execute them as examples. And yet, the attacks continued. It was like fighting smoke. Every time you grabbed it, it slipped through your fingers. The oath of silence, part of what made the Ekumeku so effective, was their discipline. To join, fighters swore a deadly oath. Betray the cause, and you betray your ancestors. This wasn't just politics, it was spiritual. Breaking the oath wasn't just treason, it was a curse. And it worked. No matter how hard the British tortured captives, very few broke. Most went to their deaths in silence. And in Anioma, their silence only made them martyrs. Children grew up hearing their names, knowing the fight wasn't just about land, it was about dignity. The British counterattacked, but make no mistake, the British weren't helpless. They had rifles. They had Maxim guns, the first machine guns in history. And they had endless reinforcements. So when the Ekumeku struck, the British struck back harder. Villages suspected of hiding fighters were burned. Crops destroyed. Livestock taken. Entire communities punished for the actions of a few. The goal was fear. Break the people, and the resistance will die. But here's the thing. Fear only works if people have something left to lose. And in Anioma, the more the British destroyed, the more the Ekumeku gained. Because every orphan, every widow, every displaced family became fuel for the resistance. By 1886, the Shadow War had grown into something the British couldn't ignore. In London, reports reached Parliament. Anioma is ungovernable. The Ekumeku must be crushed. But easier said than done. Because the Ekumeku weren't just fighting with arrows and muskets. They were fighting with time. They knew the forests. They knew the rivers. They knew patience. And patience, in war, is deadly. Chapter 3. The British fight back. By 1887, the British had had enough. Reports from Anioma described the Ekumeku as a phantom army, invisible by day, deadly by night. And for an empire that prided itself on discipline and order, being humiliated by a network of farmers, hunters, and traders was unacceptable. So, the British changed their strategy. They decided, if you can't catch a shadow, you burn the ground it walks on. The crackdown begins. Entire towns were marked as hostile zones. British columns, armed with rifles and backed by the terrifying Maxim gun, the world's first automatic machine gun, marched through Anioma. When they suspected a village of sheltering the Ekumeku, they didn't ask questions. They burned it. Roofs went up in flames, yam barns destroyed, livestock stolen or slaughtered. It wasn't war anymore. It was punishment. The British wanted to starve the Ekumeku out, to turn the people against them. But it backfired. Because with every fire, with every execution, the resistance didn't shrink. It grew. Widows sent their sons to join the fight. Fathers whispered the oath of silence into their children's ears. And the forests of Anioma grew thick with fighters who had nothing left to lose. The ambush at Ugbene, one incident sent shockwaves through both sides. A British patrol, 20 men strong, marched through the dense bush near Ugbene. Their mission was simple: flush out Ekumeku fighters rumored to be hiding there. What they didn't know was that the Ekumeku had been watching them for days. At dusk, as the patrol crossed a narrow footpath hemmed in by thick forest, the Ekumeku struck. Arrows, spears, and muskets erupted from the shadows. The British fired back, but they were trapped in a choke point. By the time reinforcements arrived, nearly half the patrol was gone. The story of Ugbene spread like wildfire. To the British, it was an embarrassment. To the Anioma people, it was proof. The Shadow Army was real, and it could win. Divide and rule shaken, the British shifted again. If the Ekumeku couldn't be destroyed with brute force, maybe they could be broken from within. The British began offering titles, money, and trade privileges to chiefs willing to distance themselves from the resistance. Those who refused often woke to find their villages surrounded. It worked in some places. A few leaders, tired of the bloodshed, took the deal. Others resisted and paid with their lives. But here's the twist. Even in towns where chiefs cooperated with the British, the Ekumeku still operated underground. The shadows didn't vanish. They simply grew quieter. The psychological war. By the late 1880s, the British introduced a new weapon: fear. Captured Ekumeku fighters were executed publicly, their bodies left hanging as warnings. Entire families were uprooted, scattered, broken apart. The message was clear: resistance is death. But in Anioma culture, death wasn't the end. The martyrs of the Ekumeku were honored, their names whispered in secret. And with every funeral, the people's anger deepened. It was no longer just about British taxes or trade monopolies. It was about identity, about survival. And that made the Ekumeku far more dangerous than the British realized. By 1890, the war had entered a new phase. The Ekumeku were bloodied, yes, but far from defeated. And the British? They were learning something no empire wants to admit. You can conquer land with guns, but you cannot conquer memory. Not when an entire people have vowed to keep the fight alive. Chapter 4: The Hidden Network. By the early 1890s, the British thought they had the Ekumeku crushed. Villages were burned, leaders executed, entire families scattered. But here's the thing. The Ekumeku weren't just a group of fighters. They were an idea. And you can't burn an idea. The oath of silence at the heart of the resistance was the Ekumeku oath. To join, you swore silence. You never revealed who recruited you. You never named your comrades. You never spoke of your missions, not even to family. This meant that even when fighters were captured, tortured, or killed, the British learned almost nothing. To them, the Ekumeku looked like smoke. It appeared, it vanished, and you could never hold it. And because the oath carried spiritual weight, breaking it meant more than betrayal. It meant death, not just by the sword, but by the ancestors. Coded messages in plain sight. The Ekumeku built a communication system hidden in plain sight. Marketplaces became meeting grounds. A basket turned upside down at a stall could signal safe passage. Palm wine gourds carved with certain marks carried messages across villages. Even folk songs sung by children carried hidden warnings. So while the British relied on reports and scouts, the Ekumeku passed orders through songs, carvings, and gossip that no outsider could decode. The spirit of the masquerade. One of their most brilliant strategies was disguising resistance under culture. Masquerades, traditional festivals where masked figures danced through the villages, became covers for military gatherings. Beneath the costumes, Ekumeku fighters moved freely, carrying weapons or delivering messages, while the British, who didn't understand the culture, dismissed it as harmless ritual. To the Anioma people, masquerades weren't just performances. They were spiritual, sacred, which meant the British couldn't easily interfere without sparking open revolt. So, while the British saw drumming and dancing, the Ekumeku were sharpening blades and plotting ambushes.